it happened on one day before that. Next day it itself is accepted and it was retracted also there. This type of publications start emerging, not only for this one, for most other things, even in reputed journal like Lancet, NEJM, everything start retracting also there. But this trial conclusively told hydroxychloroquine is not working. Recovery trial clearly told hydroxychloroquine in fact increases the death rate if you start using it there. Why we believed initially hydroxychloroquine? Based upon the in vitro data. And some of the meta-analysis also come clearly showed hydroxychloroquine has got no benefit. But why we included hydroxychloroquine in our protocol? Based upon observational data, based upon in vitro data. But unfortunately, even combination also we tried hydroxychloroquine plus azithromycin. Again, the meta-analysis showing there is no benefit of hydroxychloroquine plus azithromycin. In fact, it increases the cardiac events. It increases the mortality. That's what people are talking about it there. Why it failed? Because chloroquine or hydroxychloroquine work very well in the Vero cell culture. Unfortunately, the Vero cell model is not an appropriate model for hydroxychloroquine. We have estimated the effect in the lung cell model. Unfortunately, we didn't try in a lung cell model. We tried in the Vero cell culture model. It worked well. So we need to use an appropriate models for predicting the successful rate. Unfortunately, we didn't do that. Then second thing, lopinavir ritonavir. We have got a lot of experience as an HIV physician. We use a lot of lopinavir ritonavir. Unfortunately, lopinavir ritonavir is the first one got away. Why? Randomized control trial appeared in the month of May itself. It showed lopinavir ritonavir was not working. Why it is not working? People started lopinavir ritonavir average 9 days after the trial. And second thing, lopinavir ritonavir is highly protein bound. So the concentrations available in the lung tissue is very minimal. Even though it is available in the serum, it is not going into the lung tissue. And second thing, we started bit late. That's why lopinavir ritonavir was failed. So these are the two drugs we proposed initially in the month of March and April, either hydroxychloroquine or lopinavir. Because that point of time, remdesivir is not available in India, favipiravir is not available in India. So we thought of these two drugs along with azithromycin plus minus. That's why we formulated the guidelines. Even if you see the IDSA guidelines, it came bit late in April. It told categorically in the month of April, don't use steroids. All other things they told involve in clinical trial, put it in the clinical trial, but for steroid they said no. Why? Based upon the influenza epidemic outbreak treatment, they said steroids has got no role. But they made a big U-turn in the month of October saying that steroid is the only thing working. Remdesivir you can try in mild to not mild cases, moderate cases with very little oxygen requirement, you can try remdesivir. Even for patients on ventilator, patients requiring high flow oxygen, don't use remdesivir. Because the remdesivir benefit is only in low flow oxygen status. That's what they dig and finding and telling that this is the answer for remdesivir. So they made a big U-turn between April and October. And NIH guidelines follow similar suit there. So they're also telling you can use remdesivir for moderate cases where oxygen requirement is very minimal, low flow oxygen. In case of severe thing, the remdesivir option is not there. They given one suggestion also, we can extend the duration for severe cases. Again, the trial, simple trial clearly answered, there is no benefit of extending remdesivir for more than 10 days. Ideally, it should be given for 5 days and very selected populations. I'll come back and we need to know where to place the remdesivir. This is a trial. This is a trial that changed IDSA guidelines, that changed the NIH guidelines. That's called ACT trial, involved in US multicentric study. It showed what is the benefit. It can cut down the recovery days. For example, the patient is recovering on his own. It can cut down the symptoms for 4 days. Instead of 15 days, it can cut down to 11 days. Similarly, the mortality is even though slightly better in the remdesivir arm, but it is not statistically significant. Based upon this ACT trial, the US guidelines still sticking, remdesivir has got minimal role, particularly when the person requiring low flow oxygen. That's what they're talking about it there. So they got guidelines saying that 200 milligram stat followed by 100 milligram IV OD for 5 days we need to use. 10 days there is no benefit. For mild cases there is no benefit. Patients on ECMO or ventilator no benefit. This is what the evidence for remdesivir so far. Then came solidarity trial. This is a multi-centric, multi-country trial also there. So many centers, in fact we have participated in this trial and we have actively participated in the trial also there. It looked into 3 things. particularly the person's mortality. That is the most important primary endpoint. As a treating clinicians, whether my patients can go back home, that is the most important thing I like to know. So this trial did it and tried to see all the four harms: hydroxychloroquine, lopinavir, ritonavir, remdesivir, and interferons all failed. There is no benefit. None can prevent the death. That's what clear categorical statement from the Solidarity trial. But unfortunately, the ACT trial people start finding a lot of loopholes in the Solidarity. They're saying that this is a randomized control trial, multi-center. They're saying a lot of loopholes. This is an open label study. Criteria was not stringent. Almost all the criteria. Very difficult to do a trial in Indian scenario, and we have actively participated. So many things. I am a tertiary care hospitals. I do a lot of trials, but unfortunately, some of the small centers, government center also participated, but people don't want to accept this study. They're saying that a lot of loopholes. We don't believe it there. That is why the US is still not changed the guidelines. US has not changed. Everybody start talking about the Solidarity, but US doctors still looking about the remdesivir. In selected set of population, they want to use the remdesivir there. So dexamethasone, there is no controversy. Recovery trial clearly showed one thing is working, dexamethasone. For people who got hypoxia, unfortunately, most of Indian clinicians, they are giving dexamethasone even at the earliest stage. Please don't use dexamethasone. If you use the dexamethasone in initial stages, it increases the death rate. Only the person is hypoxic, particularly people who are on mechanical ventilation, the chances of survival is more with patients on mechanical ventilations. Remdesivir, patient on got mild oxygen requirement, like low flow oxygen. Dexamethasone for mechanically ventilated patient has got role. So recovery trial answered this one. Only one country changed based upon the Solidarity trial because US is not accepting. So what country adopted? I just checked the thing. Canadians accepted that. Canadians told mild cases no antiviral treatment. Moderate cases you can involve remdesivir but put it in a clinical trial. What we told in the month of April, anybody, any treatment you want to start, please put in a clinical trial because nothing is working. Similarly, when the patient is sick, no antiviral medications, mechanical ventilations are everything there. Consider steroids, but if you want to start remdesivir or antiviral medications, put on trial. Don't give as a conclusive treatment. That's what the guidelines they start discussing there. And UK people are more sensible to me there. They looked at the data. What is the mortality benefit? What is the benefit in mechanical ventilations? What it does? Clinical symptom or virological clearance? All the parameters they looked. Only one drug worked well, dexamethasone. The green color is working means dexamethasone is working. It reduces the mortality. It reduces the mechanical ventilations. Yellow equal to standard of care. Equal to standard of care. If you see remdesivir, it comes in the yellow column only. Even hydroxychloroquine, the symptoms clearance is better, but there is no mortality benefit. If the columns is dark, the number of patients involved is only less than 100 patients. Small trials are showing some benefit, but there is no large trial. So this is how they evaluated so many regimens and finally telling only dexamethasone. So if you see UK people, they use only steroids. They are not using remdesivir. Previously, this article was written in Clinical Infectious Disease, whether I need to give tocilizumab or not tocilizumab. Tocilizumab is an IL-6 receptor antagonist. It has got a very good role in the person requiring very high oxygen. Clinically, we treated and saved a lot of patients. Unfortunately, now a lot of trials showing tocilizumab is not working. Instead of tocilizumab, I can say whether remdesivir or not remdesivir. We need to think about it because Solidarity trial shows no benefit. And ACT trial, one subgroup of patients, we may try remdesivir. Whether remdesivir is standing or it's falling, people are asking the question. That's a controversial thing there. But what we need to do, go for the pathogenesis. When the viral load is maximum, people are thinking about a lot of observational data. It showed a couple of things is coming up, like ivermectin is coming up, and other things they are saying it has got role. But other thing like your remdesivir, very limited role they are talking about it based upon the pathogenesis approach. So one of the chairperson is from country Central America, Panama. I took the guidelines for them also. They want to use ivermectin there. They want to use, but I looked in the data, there is no good strong data or no randomized control trial to recommend it. But some of the countries, particularly the South American countries and Central American countries, they start using ivermectin more. For example, Brazil, they think about nitazoxanide also. It has got a role on paper from Brazil has published. So they're thinking about South American countries, they want to use this thing. They want to use a lot of other things because most of the country, the remdesivir is not available. The headache is over. When the remdesivir is available, only the headache is there. When remdesivir is not available, we need to think about other options there. Right now, we need to assume the remdesivir is not working, it is not available there. It's costly one there. Whenever the guidelines are not supporting, what we do, we go to the FDA to see FDA clearance for a particular indication is there or not. Unfortunately, FDA is giving a lot of emergency use authorizations. Whether it's hydroxychloroquine, they're giving EUA. For remdesivir, they're giving it for everybody, then hospitalized patients. Monoclonal antibody, yes. Convalescent plasma, yes. So FDA is not going to be reliable for me because a lot of influences from different sources there. So we can't check the FDA indications. Previously, when you go to the scientific forum, I need to say FDA approved indications. But right now, FDA approved indication is most of off-label indications to me there. So coming back to my patients now, what are they going to do? Guidelines are not helping me there. FDA is giving clearance for everything. What I need to start for this man? So if you go with the randomized control trial, if you go with the meta-analysis, it's very difficult there. On the other hand, based upon the observational data, a lot of things is turning back and turning around also is possible. To do nothing or do onto something, this is a big question mark. Every controversy, every clinician is thinking right now at this point of time. A lot of things is there. Antiviral means baloxavir. This is an antiviral, once a week therapy. Convalescent plasma, favipiravir. But unfortunately, it doesn't mention about ivermectin. Ivermectin is also there. Nitazoxanide, oseltamivir. Almost everything is mentioned. And immunomodulator therapy. These are all the key therapeutic interventions we need to consider. So this is a time we need to relook our approach. Based upon the pathogenesis, based upon the approach, we need to relook. We start eating late. I'll come back and tell what is the problem with eating late there. So this is a typical pathogenesis part. Everybody sees this slide very well. The viral load is maximum within 5 to 7 days. Afterwards, the viral load go down. Inflammatory thing sets in. But we are start using the viral agent when the person is having inflammatory phase, not in the viral phase. This is a mistake we are committing and we are doing it. Now people are telling we need to use remdesivir bit early. How early? People are not answering it there. But the person is still requiring low flow oxygen. This is what we are telling it there. So as an ID physician, what I do? Antibiotic stewardship. When I want to use an antibiotic, I need to use the right antibiotic to the right patients at the right time at the right dose. So this is a virus thing, but there is no clear-cut guidelines. I just use as an ID physician, I try to copy my antibiotic stewardship principle and apply here there. What is the right time you can call? If you fail to treat patients at appropriate time. For example, some of the asymptomatic cases, if you not treat, they can go into the severe critical cases. Similarly, mild illnesses, they can also go. If you start eating early, we can change the curve. Even in the mild cases, when the person becomes symptomatic, once you start eating with the antiviral, the person can recover well. Asymptomatic persons, if you start treating, the person can go home. But people want to know how many people are there. 85% of the people are got mild diseases. It's very difficult to predict. This is one of the recent editorial, one of my colleagues has been written there, treating COVID or we missing the window. Definitely so far we missed the window there. The window is maximum when the virus is there, that point we need to hit. Unfortunately, we are not eating at that point of time, we are eating at little later point of time. If you see the viral dynamics, the viral load is maximum in initial stages. If you eat, you can flatten the curve. Not only flatten the curve for by doing a public health approach, we can flatten the curve so that the inflammation won't set in. We need to hit early. Unfortunately, we are eating late. Even the drugs that is partially effective, if you start eating early, you can flatten the curve so that inflammation won't set in there. This is what we need to do. So this is what we need to do. Less effective drugs also, we need to start it early. We need to flatten the curve so that the inflammation won't set in, even the transmission also won't possible. Unfortunately, we are eating late. So the right time we are missing out so far. Clearly the JAC article, review article told we missed the window. So how many patients has got mild symptom, their progresses? According to them, 15% of the people has got moderate to severe disease. But 40% of the patient has got some sort of dyspnea or some chest tightness is there. If you ask the people admitted, they say chest tightness, dyspnea and exertion is there. Or shortness of breath and exertion is there. So we need not treat everybody. We need to treat selected cases. Who are all the selected cases? They can go for complications. According to the literature, people above the age of old age, but I can put the age of 60, male gender, obesity, diabetes, If you got multiple risk factors, the person has got more risk factors, the chances are bit high. So we need to go for some scoring system. For example, this is called the CAL score. We need to use the CAL score. Ideally, we need to predict the thing. CAL score of more than 9 has got a significance. Similarly, this is called CEMIC score. Spain, they use this score. Again, the criteria are same. Age, sex, comorbidity. If the male sex above the age of 60, my case is 91, above the age of 60. He's a male, he got multiple comorbid, diabetic, hypertensive, coronary heart disease, post-CABG. Along with the inflammatory markers. And the inflammatory markers is bit high. Along with the risk factors, the chances of going for a moderate to severe disease is very high on the card. So we need to start early this patient. Even though 2 days of symptoms, right now the person does not have hypoxia, we need to start early based upon the scoring system. Even this is one of the best scoring system, used almost more than 14,000 patients. Again, they also put the same scoring system as the other scoring system like CAL or CEMIC system there. So this is the best scoring system evaluated based upon the age, based upon the sex, based upon the respiratory rate. They put some of the physical signs also there. I'll come back and explain my last couple of slides, some of the diseases also using it there. So we need to use a scoring system. In the scoring system, we use 3 things. Age of the patients, sex of the patients, comorbid. How many comorbid the person has got it. So now the third choice. I told the right time is hit early when the virus is peak. And second thing is right time also I mentioned the thing there. Right patient means patient has got above the age of 60, a lot of comorbid conditions, male sex. Now right drug. We know chloroquine and hydroxychloroquine gone down and almost dead. Remdesivir is sinking. Somebody trying to pull the remdesivir, but I do not know how far they're going to pull the remdesivir out. But what is emerging now? Couple of new things like favipiravir and ivermectin is emerging now. But what basis we need to choose a drug? Based upon the efficacy, that is called in vitro effect. If you see remdesivir has got maximum in vitro effect, 87% there. But compared to your hydroxychloroquine or compared to your lopinavir, but ivermectin and favipiravir has got almost similar thing there. Because the site of action of favipiravir and remdesivir are almost same. Only thing the ivermectin is different actions. So what is the next step? Where you can place remdesivir? If you want to use the remdesivir, this is one of the WHO conferences happened recently. The speaker told clearly when the solidarity trial is out, he clearly told if you want to use a remdesivir, use in the initial phase. Between day 0 to day 3, when the person has got fever, body pain, you made the diagnosis, PCR is positive, do the remdesivir starting that day. Maximum we can start up to 5 days there. Not wait till hypoxia should happen. Ideal thing is use an inhaled form of remdesivir. It's going to come soon there, an inhaled form of remdesivir. So this is a time when the person is sick, you need to use a combination therapy. Don't go with one drug alone, remdesivir alone. You need to go with a combination therapy. So this is the conclusion for remdesivir at this point of time. If you want to use in the initial 0 to 5 days maximum. In the late stages, if you want to use as a combination therapy. Then what about convalescent plasma? People are using for patients not improving anything, their final choice. Convalescent plasma has got a very big history. For most of the things, convalescent plasma worked. But 2 things convalescent plasma is not worked. One is Ebola, other is seasonal flu. Why it has not worked? In Ebola, it has not worked because antibody titer is not sufficient. In the plasma, the donor is not a good donor. And in the influenza, it does not work because we started late. That's what we are doing. And PLACID trial in India shows convalescent plasma is not working. People hospitalized, people requiring oxygens, people on ventilator, convalescent plasma is not working. So where to use the convalescent plasma? If you see the 5 trials, randomized control trial, even I put Indian trial, there is no benefit. Mortality benefit is not there. But convalescent plasma decreases the viral load, decreases your oxygen requirement, decreases the fever. Progression to ICU is stopped. So these are all the benefits of convalescent plasma. So again, this drug is a good thing, but where to use? Convalescent plasma is safe. Yes, it is safe. Mayo Clinic proceeding clearly told it is safe. But what is a trial? 2 trials is going to answer. They are trying convalescent plasma as a post-exposure prophylaxis. Post-exposure for healthcare persons or family member exposed to the COVID, you can try convalescent plasma. Our patient has got mild disease, not moderate or severe disease, trial. These 2 trials are going to answer the thing. Right now, almost 25% to 40% of the people are enrolled in this trial. We need to follow these 2 trials to see convalescent plasma. If you want to use, do it on day 0 to day 3. So day 0 to day 3 is vital period. At point of time, you can either try remdesivir or you can try convalescent plasma. These two things you try. Then what about Mr. Trump got it? People want to know monoclonal antibody. Yes, monoclonal antibody is working. Monoclonal antibodies will work, particularly if you are giving early part of phase, you can use the monoclonal antibodies. So the efficacy, if you want to use, you can use the monoclonal antibodies. Couple of molecules clearly showed even in high viral load, the viral load is going down. That is why two companies approach FDA to give the emergency use authorization. Phase 2 trials have shown very good benefit. But again, if you see inpatient setting, the monoclonal antibody is not working well. In the mild diseases, as well as post-exposure prophylaxis, it is working well. So if you want to use early. That's a mantra. Either remdesivir you can use, convalescent plasma you can use, or you can use monoclonal antibody. But monoclonal antibody is costly. You need to give either 2.5 grams, 2.4 grams or 8 grams. Trump received 8 grams. Each gram costs around $100 in the US accordingly. We need to see how it's going to come to an Indian market. What is the cost of monoclonal antibody? Till the vaccine is going to available, the only thing that's going to prevent is monoclonal antibody. That's what the talk process is going on. It's equivalent to vaccine, prevent post-exposure prophylaxis. This is best thing there. But again, the timing is 0 to 5 days. Then what about favipiravir? Lot of talk about it's a Japanese molecule, but unfortunately not available in US. But some of the trials, clinical trials are enrolled in favipiravir. It's going on. The results we need to follow. 3 trials has came out. One is a Russian study. Lot of criticism for the Russian study because they enroll only 60 patients. In the 60 patients, only 40% has got COVID. Other 20 has got the observation harm. They didn't start the favipiravir there. And few people has got PCR positivity. The benefit is not much. But what is more important, the Japanese trial is more valid. Single blind randomized control trial. It reduces the durations of symptoms similar to your remdesivir. Almost 4 days duration is cut down there. So that is a significant trial for me, favipiravir is concerned. All 3 are randomized control, but Russian trial, lot of criticism today, they faced it now. What about ivermectin? People talking about COVID is a big one, ivermectin is a small one. Whether it's going to tackle the COVID problem, all things are amateur only there. Before they become a professionals, I can say. What about ivermectin? Ivermectin has got no antiviral effect. It acts at the level of nuclear transport blocking effect. So ivermectin. But what is the criticism? Ivermectin won't reach the levels. It requires more levels. What is the level we need to start? We are using at 200 microgram per kilogram of the body weight. So what is the dose? That's why I said right time. We need to say the right patients, right drug and right dose. If you use an appropriate dose, yes. Hence the problem, people initially thought of 100-fold, 200-fold high is needed there. But right now in plasma, it has got an excellent penetration to the lung tissue. So even if the person reaches this much of level, it can go well. Second thing, the trial showed in Virocell. In Virocell, the amount of ivermectin required is very high. But in a lung cell model, it showed it has got very low level of ivermectin is fine. How much here? This trial is going to answer. That's called cover trial. COVID in ivermectin trial that showed if you use 600 micrograms or 1200 microgram, that means 600 microgram means what is a dose? 36 milligram. Normal dose is 12 milligram, 200 microgram. 600 microgram means 3 times, 36 milligram. 1200 microgram means 6 times the dose. So we need to go with whether this dose is only we need to go for it. If we go for this level, the levels can be easily achieved on day 5. The cover trial clearly showing that we can achieve the sufficient levels of ivermectin. It does not require 100-fold, it does not require 200-fold, just 3 to 5 times the upper dose, we can get it there. And people tolerated very well this one. This is a white paper from Indian Society of Chest. They are telling that 24 milligram BD is recommended, Indian guidelines, based upon Florida retrospective data. One of the retrospective propensity match score study, they looked into the data. It showed even for severe cases, it prevents death. This is retrospective data, but the final conclusion go with randomized control trial. Just got accepted in Chest article. It showed clearly it has got mortality benefit. Ivermectin has got mortality benefit in severe sick cases. That's what this trial is showing, but the data is a retrospective data. So the editorial is clearly written. We should not rush, but we need to go for a good randomized control trial to see the effect. What about the high doses? Yes, High doses people are tolerated. For other conditions, they tried high doses of ivermectin up to 800 microgram per kg of the body weight. Even 1200 microgram they tested in this trial. Whatever thing the 1200 microgram, there is no side effects except some few olfactory visual hallucinations happen. Otherwise, ivermectin tolerated well. So ivermectin as an inhaled form, much higher levels are reached. So the two things is emerging. If you use a good dose or inhaled form, it is going to work. Not only for mild cases, severe cases, retrospective data is there. But when most of the South American and Latin American countries were pushing there, Nature article told, don't rush it, please assess the molecule effectively before rushing it in. That's a statement made by the Nature there. So most of the trials they are not answering what we know to know. What is the answer we need to give? That's what my moderator clearly asked. What you are going to tell Suresh? That's what he's telling. We need to have a robust study. For example, one trial called Retaxcova. We need to use remdesivir, dexamethasone for COVID to find out whether it's a monotherapy, whether it's a combination therapy, at what stage we need so many people, double blind, RCT is needed. But it takes long time based upon the hack trial, based upon the solidarity, where it is failed, we need to design this type of form. But this style is not going to happen. This style is not going to give the answer also most of the time. People start criticizing this one also. We need to see what are the parameter. For example, hospitalized patients, mortality is indicator we need to take. In OP setting, whether the person is getting sick or not. That's what we need to have a choose ideal out point. Unfortunately, we are not taking an ideal parameter. So that's why the JAMA wrote clearly, whether you want to do not do anything or if you want to overreact, there is an in-between way. That's called sensible way, sensible medicine there. We should follow a sensible medicines instead of not giving anything or overreacting to anything there. We need to go with a middle path. That's called the sensible path. So this is a path most of the American countries, particularly South American countries, they are doing it there. For example, Argentina, this protocol, they're following it up. They divide the symptoms mild, moderate, severe. They divide based upon the symptoms, but their validation is poor. How they validated this criteria as mild, moderate, and severe based upon the symptoms. We need to look for it there. So instead of going for a thing, validated scoring system is there: mild, moderate, severe, according to the NIH, according to the WHO. Mild means the person has got only few symptoms. For example, fever, body pain, tiredness. On the other hand, moderate means the person has got recurring oxygen. Severe cases, person requiring ventilation or not. So we need to go with a validated score rather than scoring system unvalidated. That's a problem there. Once it is validated, this protocol called IDEA protocol. I stands for ivermectin, D stands for dexamethasone, and E stands for enoxaparin, and A stands for aspirin. So they put a mild, moderate, and severe. What I would put, instead of using the mild, moderate, severe according to their protocol, adapt from WHO, adapt from NIH. Use the mild, moderate, severe. Mild cases, they put 24 milligram of ivermectin. I would suggest 3 times, 36 milligram is a minimum dose, 600 microgram dose, or you can go with 120,200 microgram. That means up to 60 milligram you can go there. Instead of 120 milligram, you can go with 120 milligram. But please, this is clinical trial. We need to enroll the patients in clinical trial. Unless enroll in clinical trial, this is not going to be acceptable there. So we need to get a consent, we need to get an ethical clearance, and we need to start a trial basis. So mild, moderate, and severe. Mild cases, there is no need for steroids. Only you can try ivermectin. They mentioned about aspirin there, but we are not keen on aspirin there. Moderate cases, along with ivermectin, doses can be increased, along with dexamethasone, along with either aspirin or enoxaparin. In critical cases, even further, instead of 48 milligram, I would prefer 60 milligram dose there. So divide the patients in mild, moderate, severe. My patient is right now, even though the person has got moderate disease there, 91% is oxygen saturation varying between 94% and 92%. Elderly, the inflammatory markers, all the prognostic indicator is there. So I would prefer minimum 36 milligram of ivermectin for him right now, along with low molecular weight. Apparently, we are giving it there because of other risk factor is there. So we are giving it. So this is the answer. Last time they told my questions, I not answered the thing. So for me, I asked the person to enroll in the trial. If the person is willing for consent, we need to start an ivermectin 3 times a day. along with enoxaparin, we need to follow it. No dexamethasone because the person is not fully hypoxic at this point of time there. So COVID management is not black and white. We need to relook our approach definitely. Time for Indian trials because we are not doing proper trials. That is the criticism there. We need to enroll the patients in trials, involve the patients. If you are not able to enroll in the trial, at least involve the patient, get the consent, and start your proposed mechanism. What is validated in other country. If you want to go alone, yes, we can go alone so that we can find a new path. We can find a new path. Most of the discoveries for Einstein not happened with the rational thinking, but we are doing a rational thinking here to find an answer there. That's what I can say. Your best teacher is your last mistake. But if you want to know the best ID, you can follow the bestofids.org. You can learn more. We've committed a lot of mistakes in the last 6 to 8 months. We need to learn from our mistakes. Thanks for the opportunity there.
Thank you, Dr. Suresh, for that wonderful presentation. Now, the message which you have given is hit hard, hit early, right drug, right patient, right dose at right time. Okay. With this, I will come back to you with more clear answers from you. Before that, I would request Dr. Subramaniam to talk to us on the controversies in diagnosis, and then we'll go for questions. Yes, Subramaniam, please go ahead.
I'm going to try and make this as quick as possible so that we can have questions at the end. So, while treatment is obviously still a very unsettled issue, a lot of it is still unsettled. We would be hoping that at least the diagnosis part of it is easier. And as we start testing, we realize that we are running into more and more trouble with regards to even the diagnosis. So let's look at a couple of situations. Okay, so these are all things we have been handling for the last couple of months. So this is a 24-year-old who was sent to me by the liver team. This is a 24-year-old gentleman who is being evaluated as a prospective donor. Not evaluated, he's been confirmed as a prospective donor for his cousin who needs a liver transplant. The cousin is quite sick, he can't wait too long. This young man, he is interested in giving his liver to save his cousin. He had COVID 2 months ago. Unfortunately, as per every international guidelines, you need 2 negative PCRs for you to be eligible as a donor. And this includes the Indian government guidelines as well. And the COVID was very mild, he recovered from that promptly, no problems. But then he's been retested every 2 weeks. And they do paired samples 24 hours apart. Inevitably, one of those 2 samples comes back positive and the other comes back negative. They tried it a month after the COVID, they tried it 6 weeks, 8 weeks, 10 weeks. It was just getting frustrating. So obviously, this is a situation where the young man is suffering from the test, not so much COVID. And this is not something which is unusual at all. Why am I saying this? And a 46-year-old businessman who travels a lot internationally, extremely big guy, well-connected, whatnot. He also suffered from COVID 2 months ago, very mild disease, got over it, didn't really need home quarantine. Now he wants to travel abroad. He has tested himself with the COVID PCR and it keeps coming back positive. And his question is, what do I do? The problem is, faking a test doesn't help because nowadays a lot of airlines, if you're traveling to a long distance, at the places where you connect, they ask you to retest. And you really don't want to get caught with a positive test in the middle of your travel because that will make your life a living hell. But unfortunately, again, this patient cannot, this person, he's not a patient, this gentleman cannot travel because he is also suffering from a positive COVID PCR. So these are examples of how a person can suffer from a test more than a disease. Let's look at another situation. We had a gentleman, an elderly gentleman who had slipped at home, fallen and broken his femur. He came to the ER. ER had a look at his hip, and the hip showed metaphyseal fracture, and they said this needs surgery. I mean, it was not emergent surgery because the patient was stable. They said, okay, we can operate the next morning. And as was for our protocol, we sent off a COVID PCR. Well, no surprises, the COVID PCR comes back positive. I mean, talking to the patient, we realize the patient is completely asymptomatic. He has no symptoms of disease. And there's nobody in the family with any symptoms related to COVID. So the question is, how valid is this PCR? Is this PCR a true positive? Is it a false positive? Or is it a persistent positive from a past infection? Unfortunately, looking at a PCR, you can never be sure what it means. Is it true? Is it false? Is it persistent? We don't know all these things. So obviously, as you can see, a COVID test, even by PCR, although it's very, very interesting and a good test, it does not answer all your questions. You have to apply your clinical judgment to it and ask yourself the question whether this person is really likely to have COVID. If you are not sure, then you better ask more questions. So, when we talk about PCR testing, we want binary answers, any test for that matter. See, for example, if you do a blood sugar, if the blood sugar comes back high, you'd like to call the person a diabetic. If the blood sugar comes back normal, you'd like to call the person a non-diabetic. You check a person's blood pressure. Blood pressure is high, you say the person is hypertensive. Blood pressure is normal, you call him normal tensive. But that's not correct. Why? Because we know the blood pressure can be normal now, and about an hour later, it can be high. Again, the person could be anxious and maybe the blood pressure was slightly high. So you have false positives and you have false negatives. And this extends to testing as well. So what about testing? So obviously what we are looking for is true positives. In the column, we want to see only true positives. Unfortunately, that's not always so. We are likely to find a lot of true positives if we test in the right clinical scenario. That is, a person who comes in with symptoms consistent with the possibility of COVID, we test by PCR and the PCR comes back positive, we know the person is having a true positive PCR and therefore the person is likely to have COVID. But then again, false positives. Can that happen? Well, it all depends on how well the PCR lab is being run. There have been all kinds of stories which have gone out in the lay media as well about COVID PCR results and things like that. I don't want to talk specifically about anything, but there was a paper a couple of months ago which even talked about the possibility of false positive PCRs, especially if the testing volume is low. Also remember, a PCR lab is not something which can be run like a regular lab. There has to be a lot of attention to detail in the way the PCR lab is run. Why? Because when you're spinning all the samples, if it is not done properly, a little bit of RNA fragments can nebulize and go and fall into the next one. And if that happens, all of it will then become positive. So you have to be very, very careful because when you run a PCR lab, you have to run it very, very diligently. If you don't run it diligently, you're going to have absolutely monkey answers. And like I said, persistent positive. A person being positive today does not mean the person turned positive yesterday. The person could have turned positive 2-3 months ago. If you look at the CDC guideline, it says do not retest for 90 days after a positive result. And just because you're positive does not mean you have disease. It just means that the test is positive. The test and the patient are not always the same thing. What about negative? So obviously, when you do a COVID test and the test comes back negative, you want to be happy because you want the test to be a true negative. You want a test which will exclude the possibility of disease. But does it always happen that way? We had an elderly gentleman who was referred to us from Andhra Pradesh. This gentleman had some altered sensorium and rapidly worsening lung situation. And the CT scan done in the emergency room was consistent with COVID. He had an esophageal PCR done already in Andhra, which was negative. When he came to the ER, he had already become so sick, he needed to be intubated and ventilated. So, in summary, he had a negative PCR outside. CT scan was suggestive of COVID. What do? We repeat another PCR. So, we sent off a BAL sample this time. We know that the nasopharyngeal sample PCR positivity pickup is 70%, which is not bad. The BAL sample is about 93%. The BAL PCR came back negative. At this point, we had a discussion. My team had a discussion. We have a nasopharyngeal PCR which is negative. We have a BAL PCR which is negative. If there are two of these negative, 70%, 90%, 93%, then negative predictive value is close to 99%. So can we safely move the patient on? Fortunately, my colleague who's trained both in pulmonology and ID, she stood her ground and said, no, this does look like COVID. I don't trust this. So we decided to send another PCR. And lo and behold, that PCR came back positive. So remember, there is no perfect answer. So even with a BAL, you can get a negative PCR. So if your clinical judgment says that the possibility of COVID is high, you may need to retest, and a negative test does not always exclude the possibility of PCR, any infection. And there are lots of reasons for this. And false negatives. Right. So let me give you another scenario. A colleague of mine who was traveling between Chennai and Bangalore for certain technical reasons, he comes to Chennai and he has another set of PCRs being done. So he has a PCR being done, and the lab decided to run it, and he got 2 results. The same lab gave him a positive report and a negative report. How does that happen? How does a person get a positive report and a negative report on the same sample? Is that even possible? The unfortunate answer is yes, it is possible. How is that possible? It's the same sample. If you did 2 separate samples, in one sample, maybe you sampled it correctly and maybe you got the virus. The other sample, due diligence was not performed in either the performation of the sampling or the method in which it was transported and things like that, and maybe you got a negative. That's understandable. But on the same sample, is it possible to get a positive and a negative result? The answer, unfortunately, is yes. How do you get that? The reason is because different platforms do it differently. So if you run it on the regular real-time PCR or the TrueNAT PCR, these PCRs are run for 40 cycles. The GeneXpert, on the other hand, is run for 45 cycles. So if a person turns positive in the 42nd cycle, the GeneXpert platform will still report it as a positive result. On the other hand, the same sample, which is run on the regular platform, will be reported negative because it will only run to 40 cycles. And this becomes positive in the 42nd cycle. So here you have a situation where the same sample is simultaneously reported both as positive and as negative. Okay, do these things happen? Yes, they do happen. So that's why you need to be very careful and ask all these questions. Which platform was it run? What is the cycle threshold? And but most important question is always, do I think the patient has COVID? Look at your pretest probability. If your pretest probability is high, you feel free to challenge the lab. If your pretest probability is low, again, if it doesn't fit the diagnosis, challenge the lab. So, going forward, I had a doctor who called me today and said, listen, I developed COVID on that 10th of, 3rd of, 10th of October, and I was off from work for 14 days. I'm an anesthetist, and I'm feeling fine now. After 14 days, I decided to redo a PCR because I don't want to put my patients at risk. And I wanted to get a negative PCR before going back to work. And he got a test done on day 15. And lo and behold, the PCR comes back positive. What do? We asked the anesthetist not to practice infectious disease, but to practice only anesthesia and move on. But here's the problem. I've had colleagues who had COVID and then they're worried. What if I contracted again in the field? So they go and get an antibody test. And the antibody test comes back negative. That's even worse. So they are asking me, 1, so was this really COVID or was this some other disease? 2, does that mean that I'm still vulnerable to the possibility of repeat infections from COVID? These are all very, very tricky answers, and let's talk about it. So there are obviously other tests other than just PCR. So the antigen test, the sensitivity is not great. If you're antigen positive, yes, you would expect to be PCR positive as well, as long as the test is being done properly. Big advantage of the antigen test is rapid, it's quick turnaround, and you can do it at a field level. But the sensitivity is poorer than a PCR. So if you're antigen negative, you still need to do a PCR, and you have to remember all the problems that come in with the PCR. What about antibody test? Here are some problems. When you say antibody test, you don't know what antibody you're testing for. Every kit will look for a separate antibody which is ascribable to the COVID virus. So that antibody presence does not necessarily mean that you had COVID. So if you had some other virus which is looking like COVID and had that particular antigen, you could have had that antibody. That's one example. The second thing is, we are not looking for the spike protein antibody, which is considered the protective antibody. So just because you have a generic antibody against COVID, it does not mean that you have the protective antibody against COVID and vice versa. We don't know the correlation, all of this. Therefore, the government of India is only recommending antibody tests in the epidemiological setting to assess the penetration of the disease in the community. The second thing is that the B cell versus T cell. Remember, we move from polysaccharide to conjugate vaccines because we want to stimulate the T cells also because it gives long-lasting immunity. But T cells don't form antibodies. Only B cells form antibodies, and you're checking for antibodies. Studies are showing that those with mild disease generally have B cell mediated activation, and therefore, T cell mediated activation, not much of B cells. In which case, you can develop immunity against COVID without forming antibodies, and that's a problem. It's great to know this because if the person develops T cell mediated immunity, that's not transferable, and therefore they are not great convalescent plasma donors. But there is no way to test commercially for T-cell mediated immunity, because the commercial tests are IGRA for TB and things like that. We really don't have a T-cell mediated immunity kit for COVID, and we don't know what this means. So we need to know that there are both B-cell and T-cell mediated mechanisms, and we don't have good kits to measure the T-cell arm of it. And finally, it's a moving target. What do I mean by that? The virus is mutating quite fast, and the virus is ever changing. We know that the virus that is existing today in circulation is quite different from the virus that we had 6 months ago. And the point is, immunity that one person may have developed 6 months ago, we don't know how well it will cover against the virus now because it may have changed significantly. And in fact, quite a few of the reinfections are being ascribed to the fact that there has been so much drift in the antigen, if you want to call it that, of the virus, that it becomes a little difficult for the immune system to recognize it as COVID and mount an efficient antibody response, immune response, and kill the virus. So the point is that this is likely to continue to happen, but we don't know the magnitude or the severity of this. Finally, imaging. Now, obviously, a lot of people have relied on imaging to understand the severity of COVID and to assess who is at risk for severe disease and things like that. Obviously, you need to know a lot of things about imaging in COVID. So people are reporting the CT scan based on what is called as a CORAD score. That is the likelihood of it being COVID. Here's the problem. Number one, if the CT is not being done at the right time, all the CT scan reports are questionable. People are doing CT scans on day 1 and day 2 of illness. It's way too early to assess the lung injury with that. So that doesn't make sense. Second, routinely doing CT scans for everybody is just an overkill, and we are just unnecessarily irradiating a lot of people, and that's also not appropriate. Third, a lot of these things need to be reported by people, radiologists who have a lot of experience in this. And very often we see a lot of dichotomy between radiologists who report this. We've had reports which have gone from CORADS 5 to CORADS 2 and whatnot, and vice versa, where, with the same image being reported by two different people as two different things. And when you have that kind of reporting, you need to ask yourself, how accurate is this in predicting the possibility of COVID? So please be very careful. Whenever you see a report, don't just look at the report, also look at the films and make yourselves comfortable with what COVID looks like. Lastly, CT severity score. Now, this is a score which is often reported in all the CT scans. It's useful in knowing how much injury there is. But again, this is a dynamic issue. It's a moving target. You may see, let's say, 10 out of 40 injury, score of 10 out of 40. That's fine today. But if the person is still having ongoing inflammation, in a couple of days' time, it will go from 10 out of 40 to 36 out of 40 in about 3-4 days' time. So what does a 10 out of 40 mean? It really means nothing. So you need to understand that it's a snapshot in time. It's not a video, it's just a photograph. And therefore, you need to correlate it against the patient's clinical situation, their inflammatory markers, and various other things, and then decide what is appropriate for them. And you can't have radiology alone telling you what is the right treatment. It tells you how severe the situation is right now, but it does not tell you what is going to happen in the next couple of days. And that will be based on clinical decision making in conjunction with laboratory testing. And role of X-ray, a lot of people may or may not have access to CT scans. Problem is, X-ray is a very poor choice when it comes to testing for COVID, because a lot of things look very similar on X-ray. And finally, you need to have significant changes in the chest diagram for you to be able to pick it up, whereas the CT scan is far more sensitive in picking up early disease. So with this, I'm going to invite everybody to our ID conference, which is going to start on the 21st of November. The flyers are out. So those of you who are interested, thank you, and I'll stop now.
Thank you, Dr. Subramaniam. I think before I go to Patavi, let me finish with you, Subra, because you have opened a very important subject of diagnosis. So in your opinion, for all our viewers, what do you think is the way which we follow? Every day we are getting a patient. Give us a simple answer. I know there are complications in RT-PCR and all those things. Now, tell me clearly, just 5-4 lines, what one should do when somebody has symptoms, and how do we go about diagnosis?
Okay, so it's basically back to basics. Start with the history. We've been taught this since medical school. Let's follow that. Start with the history. Determine if you're thinking of COVID. If you're thinking of COVID, then go ahead and do the PCR. If the person presents with the urinary tract infection, then COVID is not the major problem. So start with clinical symptoms. decide on doing a PCR based on the clinical symptoms, and then decide if it is required to do further testing like blood testing and CT and things like that. It should not be algorithmic. It should not be a one size fits all. Second, remember that no test is 100% accurate. You need to ask yourself if this test fits the person. If it doesn't fit the person, do not be shy about retesting or asking for help. Third, whenever you see things which are not happening as per the usual plan or the usual disease pattern, always go back and reassess and see if an alternative diagnosis is being missed, because we have had patients with DKA being mislabeled as COVID and things like that. So always ask yourself if the diagnosis is correct. Always comes back to that. Go back to the diagnosis. The diagnosis is everything. If the clinical diagnosis is wrong, then everything becomes wrong.
Okay, Subra, once you find that the patient has got COVID, when do you do the other tests like CRP, IL-6, and when do you do that? Do you do for all the cases?
What we do is, most of the patients who develop COVID are going to get better no matter what we do. So the good news is they're all going to be fine. At this point, at least, there is inadequate evidence for me to show that therapy for everybody is going to make a big difference in terms of outcomes. Because I'll have to treat a lot of people who are going to get better anyway and subject them to unnecessary side effects by having a universal treat approach. I want to identify people who are high risk. Second thing is that, remember, it's not the virus which causes a lot of death, it's the inflammation. Our protocol is very simple. The first 3 days, unless they are high risk situation like post-transplant or something, we really don't do anything. For ordinary population, we tell them stay at home, take paracetamol, take cough syrups, be comfortable, hydrate well, and things like that. Therefore, if they are not well, we ask them to come to the emergency services, at which point they are assessed to see if further testing is required. The majority of patients do not get testing. Some people get testing in terms of blood markers. We do a CRP, LDH, CBC, D-dimer, and things like that. We don't routinely, we used to do IL-6, we've stopped doing that. CT scan in some patients, yes. In a lot of patients, yes. And based on those, the CT scan is basically as a buffer to the COVID testing. The PCR does not always pick up. On day 4, day 5, when you do a CT scan, if you see the GGOs, which are typical, a good radiologist will be able to pick up COVID. So we do that. And that is only if they have ongoing clinical symptoms. If they're asymptomatic, leave them alone, they're going to be fine. Then based on that, we risk stratify them and then decide where they go. About 85 to 90% of our patients go home. A small percentage will go to the ward for assessment and observation.
Okay, Patavi, Dr. Subra was saying about the CT scan. What do you think the role of CT scan for diagnosis? When somebody is RT-PCR negative and you take a CT scan and you still think that the patient has got COVID, will you go ahead and treat as a COVID patient, or you will again do a RT-PCR?
Yeah, so if the clinical picture fits in with the CT, then it would be considered as COVID. We'll have to have a discussion with the patient. If they predispose the CT as COVID, we can continue treatment, and you can also repeat it. If you repeat the PCR probably 1 or 2 days later, and you can still get a positive report. So CT is very helpful there. Now, as far as diagnosis goes, CT can be useful when the PCR is negative, but the clinical feature is suggestive. The only other need for CT are very few. When a patient is on treatment is developing sudden breathlessness, where you think that it's probably pulmonary embolism, or at the end of the treatment or at the end of thing, if you think that the patient has received a lot of oxygen, patient had a severe course, and if the patient is a candidate to develop a post-COVID fibrosis, or he's showing symptoms of post-COVID fibrosis, that will be the time that we take a CT. So apart from these 3 indications, I would say that CT is required. Now, there is an extreme overkill. Everyone who goes in, everyone who is everyone wants to get a CT, and you can see, I mean, we've seen patients who almost get CT every 3rd day and have a bunch of CT scans, and they exist that we see all those. And in fact, I could see a few CTs which shows some fibrosis, which is not definitely post-COVID, probably a radiation fibrosis. That's the kind of radiation that people actually have. So CT is a very specific indication as far as COVID goes, and it's not for every patient's satisfaction that we'll have to, succumb to writing. Writing a scan is easy, but I think we have very specific recommendations for that.
Patavi, regarding CT, prognostically, do you do prognostic? Because I have a patient who
Yes, sir.
was there 14 days treatment. When he came out, the CT showed 30 by 40, something like that. He was worried, but he's well and healthy, no problem, no symptoms. But the CT says 30 by 40, something like that. What do
Yes,
you say about that?
there is no study that says that the single point assessment on the CT will have any prognostic, effect. I mean, since the CT looks like this, you're going to, do well or don't do well. Because as I think Dr. Subramanian has clarified that, it's a single point assessment, so you'll never know. It depends on at what point of the illness your CT was taken. It can range from, severity of 0 by 24 or 0 by 40 to, 36 by 40 ultimately. So, we have very specific, see, there's beautiful CTs we see actually. We've seen lovely CTs. It's a joy to watch those CTs because a lot of things are happening. There are consolidation and the blood vessels dilate inside. The blood vessels are very prominent inside. It's a subpleural thing. It's a beautiful thing, but most of it is not required actually. So, you can actually assess the progress of what is happening. CT at the time of a discharge in some patients where there is a significant exercise limitation will give an idea whether the patient is developing a fibrosis. Now, so that will lead on to another controversial topic about whether there is a role for an antifibrotic and when, at what point and all that. So I think we still don't have any data as far as the timing of further interventions in terms of fibrosis. But CT is kind of given us an idea as to what are the patterns that can be seen in COVID. But they do not really predict anything about whether this patient is going to develop a mortality or they're going to do well or not. So that is unfortunately CT is not a predictor of anything.
Subra, do you do antibody tests for everybody when they get discharged? Do you do repeat PT or do you do antibody?
We give them multivitamins, tender loving care, and home care instructions.
Okay, because you are talking about some of your case studies where you are doing antibodies, and then you are talking about T cell, B cell. I'm just asking, is it necessary?
No, we don't. We actually tell them not to, because I have had colleagues who go home after a moderate illness, and then 2 days later, on day 15, day 16, they have their own blood test done. One of my colleagues had a IL-6 level of 4,977. His wife, who's also a physician, calls me up in a panic, kind of thing. So we aggressively treated him with 1 tablet of multivitamin 2 times daily for the next 7 days, and he became better.
Okay, suppose a person after 14 days is hale and healthy, discharged. Suppose he wants to know whether COVID is recovered or not. They will be very curious. They're asking you, and again, RT-PCR, what is your advice? You will say no, or you will say, okay, you do.
I can't stop anybody from doing anything. I tell them that, see, there is no way to stop you from doing anything, but understand what the test is for. No test has been designed for showing no problem. There is no test for no problem. There is only test for problem. You can test for malaria. There is no test for no malaria. There is no test for no hypertension. We can only test for XYZ. We cannot say, do a test and say, therefore, no XYZ. Therefore, second thing is, we treat patients, we do not treat tests. Third, very good carrot. I tell them, if you get this tested and it will come back positive, the chance of come back positive is very high, in which case the corporation will land up in your house. They will put tin sheets and whatnot, and then entube you inside it for another 2 weeks at least. They'll put posters up in your locality with you. You will become very famous / notorious. If that's what you want in your life, please go ahead. That usually works.
Subramaniam, you said persistent positive. Yeah, I had a case who had COVID 21 days over. Now he is going for elective surgery. The hospital did a RT-PCR. It came as positive. Then the people said we won't do the surgery. So what is your comment on that?
At my place, we don't have a problem. If it's emergency surgery, even during COVID, we've had patients having neurosurgery, orthopedic surgery, and all that stuff. I've had bowel resection being done in a person who was active COVID because it's emergency. Second, once the period of quarantine is over, we just give them a clearance saying it's acceptable. And fortunately, my colleagues are very sensible about it. They accept it at face value. They go ahead and take them in the non-COVID area and handle them as a clean case.
No, I was talking about elective surgery, not emergency surgery.
Absolutely, even elective. See, the only place where I cannot do that is transplant because the guidelines are very clear. Outside of transplant, it's absolutely no problem. We give them a letter saying that they're clear and they can go for surgery.
is a doctor who was having COVID. 21 days later, he wants to know whether he can go for work. Can he go for work?
Yeah.
Positive, but he's positive.
No, sir, in my hospital, for mild to moderate cases, day 11, they better get their backside to work. They are not going to get any more days off than that. Day 11, that is 10 days of,
Irrespective,
from onset 10 days and 1 day without symptoms, without paracetamol. 10 by 1. On day 11, they better get their backside. If they take 12 days to defervesce, then day 13, whatever, 1 day extra after that. But we are very anal about them getting back to work. We are not going to give them one single day extra. If they take it, it's going to be from their own kitty. So we are very particular about that. I was back to work on day 11, so there's no reason for extra days.
Okay,
And
and you won't submit them for another PCR before they discharge. No.
There are special situations. Let me explain. There are special situations. Like I said, transplant is one, travel is another one. So if you are traveling between states and all that, if there are restrictions on that, yes, you may have to do that. International travel, for example, yes. Outside of governmental regulations, I do not do routine testing.
Okay, how long normally it takes for RT-PCR to become negative? In general, I'm not asking.
Impossible to say.
Normally, if I'm positive today, after treatment of 15 days.
It can be up to 3 months.
Okay, and you were talking about cycle threshold. What is the importance of cycle threshold?
It's a tricky answer. In that, cycle threshold is basically the way by which we calculate the amount of virus in a sample. When you do HIV, HCV and all that, it is a calculated value based on this number called the cycle threshold. So if you have a lot of virus, then the PCR flags it very, very quickly. If you start with less, it takes longer time for the PCR to become positive. The same thing in your gene expert. Sometimes when you do a TB gene expert, it says high, medium, low, very low and all that. It depends on how much the target is there to start with. If there is a lot of the MTV, let us say, it will pick it up at an earlier cycle itself, in which case it will say detected high. Same thing. So if your cycle threshold number is small, it means the amount of virus you started off is very, very high. But the problem is, it depends on how well the sample has been taken. So two people sampling the same patient on the same day can get different numbers if it is not done in a standardized manner. So it's a little tricky. You got to be very careful. The trend towards numbers is that if the sample is done well and the analysis is done well, generally speaking, if your cycle threshold is 30 and above, the chance of infectivity is astronomically low for routine use. I'm not talking about intubated patients. For routine purposes, the chance of infectivity is quite low.
Okay, will you do antigen test for your patient to screen, or you will do only RT-PCR?
We are not doing antigen
now in your practice?
No, we are not doing antigen
rapid antigen test.
No, we are not doing it. The problem is that, sir, it's a bit of hit or miss, because if it's negative, the recommendation is still to go for a PCR. So for me, if I want to do it, I might as well do a PCR.
You are not audible.
No. What I said was, the problem is it's a bit of a hit or a miss. If it's negative, I still have to reflex it to a PCR. So it increases the time for me. So I might as well go directly for a PCR if I really think it's necessary.
So you don't do antigen tests in your setup, no? Because in Coimbatore, we don't have those tests done.
The Tamil Nadu government is also not too happy about antigen testing.
Okay.
And I think there's some rationale to it. That's fine.
Patabi, how long it takes for CT just to show somebody has COVID today? The changes to occur, how many days will normally happen? 3 days, 4 days? Because with day one, if you do, it is negative.
Yeah. So, I mean, looking at the logic, if the viral travels down, so virus travels down. So, in a very mild case, might not even reach. But even in even in a completely asymptomatic patient, you can see some GGOs happening. So, actually, I do not know the answer as to what time actually it happens. But the best guess would be, I mean, if you start doing it around third or fourth day, I think it should be positive. But I don't think there is anything that suggests that you'll have to do it on such and such a day. If the patient is symptomatic, there is a 92% chance that you have a lesion in the CT. That's what it says. So, you should have a symptomatic patient, then you have a high chance of picking it by CT. In asymptomatic, we do not know how long it takes and whether it's going to be as sensitive as it is in asymptomatic patients.
Okay, Suresh, now so far you are keeping quiet. I will come to you. Suresh, are you there? Okay. Now you have given so many options, like ivermectin, remdesivir. What is your protocol? Suppose somebody comes the day one and they have fever. As Subra said, you give Dolapa, paracetamol, and then 3 days. Okay. Fourth day they are sick. When do you start antiviral? Because you say hit hard, hit early. So what is your protocol?
No, I said right patients and right time is also the right time only I mentioned. If possible. Right. And yeah, everybody.
Suresh, I think you switch off your video and answer because you are not audible. You switch off your video, Suresh.
I'm audible now.
You can switch off your video. Now you answer now.
I think
Yeah,
you
you are
are
audible very well. Yes.
okay. So usually for everybody, we are not
Go ahead.
everybody we are not recommending treatment. Right? It's most important. The right patient is concerned, patient above the age of 60, male patients, multiple comorbidity. Right? The person made a diagnosis, clinical diagnosis COVID, and confirmed by the PCR, the person. The third thing is that the tricky one. So far, the evidence, if we go with the UK-based guidelines, none of them save the patient. The persons from mechanical and shown when the person compared to the persons who are not improving that. This is the outcome. For other things, there is study population. If favipiravir is not studied well, ivermectin is emerging, but whatever dose we are. So this scenario is this paid from the packet, not from the insurance point. So they're paying from the. I think for an ivermectin is a well-tolerated drug. We can put it trial basis. I'm not starting ivermectin. Please get the consent.
I think Suresh,
Yes, sir.
you are not very clear. I'll ask you one simple question, then you answer. Do you use remdesivir in your patient?
Yes, I am using remdesivir right now for patient with mild hypoxia. Patient is confirmed with the I'm using it.
Okay. If you are using remdesivir, when do you start remdesivir? On day 3, day 4, day 5?
And the patient present to the hospital with mild hypoxia, the person present little early, up to 7.
Okay. When do you use Decadron, dexamethasone?
When the person become more hypoxic, particularly the person is on mechanical ventilations or recovering hypoxygen, you after 7 days. But anytime the person become hypoxic, mechanical ventilations, we need the software.
No. I don't understand. Only with the person who is going for mechanical ventilation, you are using dexamethasone, or even when the patient is hypoxic, even without mechanical ventilation, you give dexamethasone.
They are using hypoxia itself, they are using dexamethasone.
Okay. And when do you use heparin, flaxaparin?
Usually, all hospitalized patients with a significant pneumonia needs access there.
Okay. How long you give the heparin?
Usually till the patient is getting discharged. At the time of discharge, we use a scoring system there. We are using a scoring system. The person is up to the 25 person under state ICU, anticoagulants for 2 weeks.
Okay. Do you give them aspirin when they get discharged?
No, some our center is not doing. Only the IDF is there. And protocol and said differing there.
Okay, you have started using ivermectin for your patients now, 24 milligram, 32 milligram.
36 milligram, we have started enrolling in a clinical trial basis there. Patients who are sending home taking multivitamin, point of time, if the person is willing, they can do that, right?
Do you give ivermectin and remdesivir together?
No, Some of the Bangladesh studies showed ivermectin plus doxycycline has got a role, but we're not using ivermectin plus there. Using ivermectin only in outpatient setting.
And don't you use Pepavir in the day 1, day 2, like in OP patients?
If the person is willing to take it, ivermectin or favipiravir, they can take it. But favipiravir, the pill burden is a bit high. First day they're supposed to take 1,600 milligram BD. That means 8 tablets. 60 tablets they're supposed to consume. That's a bit difficult. And the favipiravir, what is Japanese control the symptoms. And cough favipiravir is also a bit high for Indians there. Ivermectin, why we are going for it? Because of the cough distance. And second thing,
So you don't use Favipiravir in your practice?
no, it's a trial basis. We give all the options. We ask the patients what will happen. I prefer ivermectin over
Don't you use the remdesivir in outpatient? You give the injection, ask them to take the injection at home or in their own setup?
We tried outpatient antibiotic therapy because the challenge is also the injection. It's a bit difficult there. But we arrange some of the patients as a right now we are considering and we will only for 3 days. Recommendations. So we are giving a couple of patients only there. Almost 3 to 5 patients we have put outpatient. The big challenge is patient come for the bit difficult there.
Okay, you said convalescent plasma also should be given early on the day 4, day 5. Are you using that in your patient clinic, in your practice?
Right now, we didn't offer because the Tamil Nadu government drug control of India is not to give convalescent plasma. But according to the US trial, we wait for the report. Usually not day 5. Day 0 to day 3 is an ideal answer. Because compared to remdesivir, convalescent plasma is cheaper in Indian context.
You don't use tocilizumab nowadays, even if the IL-6 is more?
So, when the person is not responding to steroids, high inflammatory markers, along with other inflammatory markers, 6.
Do you use any monoclonal antibody apart from this?
No, the monoclonal antibody is not Mr. We don't right now. Phase 2, they apply for in US.
Do you use baloxavir?
No, Baloxavir is also not available to me right now, so I'm not using it.
Do you use colchicine?
Couple of cases with not affordable for not affordable for the thing suggested, but we are not used so far there.
Okay, I think Suresh, whatever you have said, please put it in writing as a slide and give it to me. I will circulate among our groups because half of your words I could understand, but many people are, they say audio not clear. So I would appreciate if you can, write it in chat box or send it to me as your protocol, whatever you said, I will circulate. Patabi, what is your take on the anti-fibrotic drug? When the CT scan is more problem.
Sure.
Do you use anti-fibrotic drug routinely?
No, not as a routine. Now, before I think I'll move to this, I thought I'll just clarify what Dr. Suresh had said because the audio was not that thing. I think one particular thing about steroids is what I think is very important for all the things because rest of the drugs, even if you don't give, there's not an issue at all. It's only the steroids, the DEXA, and it never started when there is no hypoxemia. There is the linearity as long as the hypoxemia goes. It's helpful when there is hypoxemia. It's more helpful when the hypoxemia is more highest when there is an intubated patient. The number needed to treat, say one patient who is intubated is 8. Then you have to treat 8 to get one saved, whereas it's about 25 to 30 when it is a mild to moderate hypoxemia. So hypoxemia has to be tagged with steroids, and even if you don't give anything else, I think that we are doing quite okay. So that's what we think because it was up and down, and I think that's what Dr. Suresh Kumar was meaning.
Okay. What if you give steroids even if they're not hypoxemic? As a
there has been very clearly data to show that if you use steroids early, especially the early stage of your viral disease, generally in viruses that has been shown even in meta-analysis in swine flu, earlier MERS and SARS that happened in 2003, it showed that steroids should not be given. That's why steroid is never advocated and only this trial which showed that hypoxemia steroid helps. Otherwise, there is in fact a trend towards a higher mortality when you give early in the disease, because it will inhibit the viral clearance by our body's immune system. So
Yeah.
never give steroids early. Never give it when there is no hypoxemia. So I think that is what is very important about the steroid.
Antifibrotic, about antifibrotic drugs.
Antifibrotic, yeah, so there is no data. So it's a simple answer. There is no data. We've very clearly seen that there is a fibrosis that happens in some patients who have COVID. And is there a way to predict that these are the patients who are going to go for fibrosis? No, but there has been studies which have shown that there are certain markers, especially from Wuhan. They've said that people who are old, people who have higher CRPs and higher inflammatory markers, people who had a higher length of stay, people who are on steroids for more thing, and people who had a length of stay and intubation. These are the patients who ultimately have a higher chance of developing a fibrosis. Having said that, there is no data as of now to say whether antifibrotic. There are only two, antifibrotics that are involved. One is pirfenidone. The second is nintedanib. Now, both these drugs have been used in all the other fibrosis due to interstitial lung disease. It can be an idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis, and also in every progressive fibrotic interstitial lung disease, these drugs have come to have some role. Whether that can be extrapolated to COVID, that is what people are doing. As in most other interventions, it is done because there is a logic, but there is no data. We give in patients who, I mean, if you want to give it, so it is going to be only out of logic and reasoning, and you can stretch your logic in a way that these are non-specific antifibrotic, and since the mechanisms and the mediators which are involved in both idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis and the post ARDS have some kind of a commonality, there has been tried, and there are actually in clinicaltrials.gov there are at least 4 studies that are currently undergoing, both with pirfenidone and nintedanib. Till we get that in a randomized fashion, we do not know. However, since there are certain logic to it, we give in certain group of people after explaining the fact that it is not driven by data. And so a short answer for this is, do you have to give antifibrotic? Answer is no. Do you know whether it is going to be helpful? Answer is again, I do not know. If you have to give it, at what point will you give it? So again, it is directed more by logic than data. There is an organizing pneumonia stage. As we go from a GGO to organizing pneumonia, from there it just either gets better, as in most of the cases, and becomes normal, or in certain group of people, we do not know why, develop this tendency to fibrose from that organizing pneumonia stage. So if you have to prevent that fibrosis, you'll have to find out at the time of organizing pneumonia. That is why more people are doing a CT at the time of discharge to see if there is anything, or at least CT at the first review to see if there is an organizing pneumonia, and then start your antifibrotic there. If you have to start it there, how long do you give? Answer, we do not know. We actually repeat your diffusion lung capacity and a 6-minute walk test as a routine and find out how these people are going. Having said all this, we've seen people, especially the younger ones, who had developed a fibrosis. End of 6 weeks, we repeat them. Everything is disappeared without any antifibrotic. So we cannot really say that it is because of antifibrotics people improve. So till we get any answer as to a thing based on the data or an RCT, at this point, as in most of the other interventions in COVID, it is up to philosophy rather than data that is going to direct us. If I think that it's important, I'll start giving it. If I have to give it, I'll start at this time of organizing pneumonia stage. I'll give it. See, the difference between nintedanib and pirfenidone is nintedanib is pill burden is less, 150 milligrams twice a day, whereas in pirfenidone we usually escalate the dose from starting from 200 tries dose all the way to 600 to 800 tries. So that is the kind of dose that people tolerate very poorly if you escalate it very fast. So these are the issues with antifibrotic. Remains controversial, unfortunately, at this particular point.
So at no point of time you will give antifibrotic based on the CT scan report.
Yes, we will give. If we have to give, it has to be given based on the CT and pulmonary function finding, which means we'll have to decide only after the first review.
And the interleukin is very costly compared to the.
So that it was like that till about a couple of weeks ago. Nintedanib was around 1.3 lakhs, and the company had certain patient programs which brought it down to around 60,000 per month. Now There are Indian generic, because Nintedanib has it's out of patent, so there are at least two Indian companies that are come with Nintedanib, the same thing, 150 milligrams BD, which now the price is equivalent to Pirfenidone, and hence there is more of Nintedanib now than Pirfenidone as far as our thing. If you have to start.
Yeah, Patavi, before you leave, what about the prone ventilation, this high flow and oxygen and ventilation, all the indications for this?
Yeah, sure. So I'll be very quick in this. Self-proning without ventilation, the patient comes to you. Yes, he's slightly hypoxemic. At that point, it's very useful to shift the patient prone. Ask him to self-prone. Wait for 30 minutes and see if there is a significant improvement in saturation. If there is a significant improvement in saturation, then ask them to remain prone as long as they can, and at least for 2 to 3 hours, for at least 2 to 3 times a day will be a good enough thing. And if the patient is used to lying prone during his sleep, we actively encourage them. So this is for people who have mild hypoxemia. People who have absolutely normal oxygenation, we don't really bother. People who have a mild hypoxemia, 92-93% saturation, we would like to have them self-prone. We've seen a lot of people having a 92-93%, once they flip prone, and then it becomes 97-98, and so people also feel the difference. There can be reduction in tachypnea. So this is very glaring. You don't need a trial, because we don't need to wait for things. We don't need a randomization. You can see, if you spend some time with the patient, you will know that it works. But can this be extrapolated to people who are on HFNC, NIV? It is technically possible. So people, even in an ICU setup or a HDU setup, try to prone with the HFNC and non-invasive ventilation, because it is possible. Though we continue to see a good amount of improvement, there has been one large study which came out in critical care in 2020 October. This is 3 weeks ago in critical care. It is a Spanish network trial which included 36 centers, and they screened about 200 people who were on HFNC and in an ICU setting, and they tried to have it was an observational study. There was no randomization, but it was an observational. Then they matched it, and they found out that it did not really help in reduction in number of intubations, which is what we ultimately want. So that was only one large study. This is a very well done study, but then there are biases and there are other issues because of that. But barring this study, everything else, where case reports, small case series, were all supporting having a self-proning despite having HFNC. We do not know whether this particular observation study is going to change the way we actually think. At best, it is a hypothesis generating. We'll have to kind of sit back and see whether we need to really prone the patient while the patient is on a high HFNC. So, because in that study, it says that we have delayed intubation by at least 1 day because of the self-proning. So, but that did not translate into a 28-day mortality. Having said that, it's a very interesting study to really look at. Once the patient is intubated, there is no question proning always has been of a significant help, and that's been both in ARDS due to non-COVID, and observation in COVID also seems to help. So as far as proning is concerned, before intubation, in milder cases, definitely helps in improving hypoxemia. In moderate to severe cases where you have a HFNC, we do not know. There is one trial which says that it doesn't prevent intubation, but we still, the jury is still out, as I would say. Once the patient is intubated, you can continue to prone. So these are the things about proning.
Subra, how often you do CRP? You do on a 4th day, you said. After that, will you follow up CRP quite frequently and before discharge?
For patients who are outpatient care, they don't really need anything further. If we think they are low-risk patients, they don't need anything at all. Once we admit them, our experience has been that the CRP actually shows the way in which the patient is progressing. A lot of times when we have ignored a rising CRP, they end up requiring oxygen sooner rather than later. So in fact, that's why I think that the publication in the Journal of Hospital Medicine, where they looked at CRP to decide on steroid use, becomes especially relevant. While I think decisions are based on oxygen, I think if you allow, a lot of people will require oxygen. The question is, can CRP help predict that? Obviously, CRP is not a perfect answer. It has to be taken in conjunction with other things. Like if you have a patient with a fracture, recent burn, something, anything, CRP is going to be high. So CRP cannot be looked at in isolation. But a rising CRP, biomarkers should always be looked at in a serial manner. A rising CRP always sends off alarm bells. We do it every 48 hours. If 2 serial numbers are good I mean, 0, 48, and 96, they're good. We don't do it after that. But if they're rising, then our antennae are up. We're looking to see if the patient is worsening, especially if they continue to have inflammatory symptoms like fever, body ache, loss of appetite, things like that. If you have all of that, we know hypoxia is coming.
Okay. Regarding routine tests, even outpatient in a home setup, you don't do any tests at all, even not even CBC to find out lymphocyte, nothing.
Okay.
Just leave them alone.
Yeah. 85% of the patients are going to have no problem at all. They are going to suffer from the testing rather than the disease.
Okay. So you don't advise if the patient comes only at the hospital, you do the test and then you do the CT scan also. Do you do CT scan for all admissions or only you judge the patient?
Okay, so that's a good question. See, the reason why we do CT scan is twofold. Number one, that the PCR pickup is only 70%. So obviously, a single PCR cannot be a means of excluding COVID. That's a big problem. The second thing is, PCR positivity and negativity does not correlate with severity of COVID. We've had patients who went up on a ventilator and the esophageal PCR at that time was negative. So what does that mean? We only had 3 negative PCRs, the fourth one was positive. So PCR test to me is a joke. So I don't rely too much on PCRs. If a person clinically needs a CT, I'm going to do a CT for 2 reasons. One, because if the sporide score is very high, the probability of it being COVID is very, very high, irrespective of what the PCR says. The second thing is a CT scan, a plain CT scan is available to me 24/7. A PCR is not available to me 24/7. And that's a problem. For an infection control perspective, I need rapid triaging. I can't wait for 24 hours for the patient to remain in a clean area and then panic. That would be the definition of an infection control disaster. So I see a value in doing CT scan. But I think it's also important to not run away with the idea that everybody needs a CT scan every time. If we decide to do a CT, we never do it with the first 3 days because it's of low value. Why? Even if the CT is consistent with COVID, the majority of patients are going to get better no matter what. And in my experience, I have not seen anybody crapping out in the first 3 days. The earliest I've seen people becoming hypoxic and crashing is day 4, day 5. That's why we tell our patients, if you are having fever for more than 72 hours, you come to our ER at the end of 72 hours, we will triage you, we will decide if a CT is required, we will decide if blood tests are required, and based on that, take decisions. Majority of patients, like I said, go home. Again, to me, it's because it's better than a PCR testing at the height of the epidemic. Remember, now that the numbers are coming down, your false positivity from the CT scan is going to go up. So you can't have a one-size-fits-all.
Okay. Suresh, I think your internet is now better. Ivermectin, is it ICMR recommended thing or it is your protocol?
No, ICMR is just ivermectin from. It's not my protocol there. Actually, I had taken the protocol from a couple of published studies there. One is cover trial, exposure, ivermectin in COVID trial that was started there, that enrolling the patient right now that is happening in US. The second one is the Argentina trial, what I discussed in the last meeting, the controversial. That trial only, it is in preprint stage right now. They submitted the paper. It is in a I have taken the IDEA protocol from there. So based upon the thing and based upon the in vitro data, where we can achieve the ivermectin at safe levels, where reach the level so that it can kill the virus. That's what I taken from the in vitro data, as well as from the preprint from Argentina paper. And along, we need to wait for the cover, unless the cover trial has this big ongoing there. But right now, if you start put it in a trial and use a high dose, or you can go 60 milligram. We have not gone to 120 milligram there.
How long you give ivermectin?
Usually 5 days is there. 5
Okay, 5 days ivermectin. Okay, I think it's time to wind up. Now I will come one by one. Subra, your clear pictures for all our viewers, what to do, what not to do. Just your message.
I remember my boss teaching me that the most important thing in making a diagnosis is clinical history taking. It's never been more relevant than it is today. So please make sure you assess your patient clinically. Do not get fooled by X-rays or fancy PCR tests and things like that. Be a good clinician, and that will help your patient and yourself in a big way. Second, always pay attention to the safety of everybody, both yourself and the people around you. So infection control protocols are very, very relevant, and they continue to remain so for the foreseeable future. Third, please do not become complacent because it's not gone away. We have a lull. We don't know what is going to happen in the future. And we are hearing of reinfection. So for that reason, please remain safe and vigilant and understand the value of every test that you order. No test is perfect by itself. Every test has an Achilles heel, some more than others. So understand what you're asking. Otherwise, it's in American parlance, ego. Garbage in, garbage out.
Okay. You are not safe until everyone is safe. That is a message. Very good. Patabi, your final message, clear message overall.
Okay, overall, I mean, there are a lot of interventions that's been talked about. Stick to basics. As far as CT goes, try to take it when there is a clinical evidence of COVID and when there is no PCR becomes negative. That will be the time that you do it for diagnosis, and then you can use it for subsequent clinical reasons if you suspect anything like an embolism, or if you think that a patient is developing a fibrosis clinically. So that is when you'll have to use CT to substantiate what you're trying, and it has to result in some actionable intervention. Otherwise, just taking a CT for sake of just doing it is definitely not helping at all. And as far as interventions that are other than pharmacological, self-proning is very useful, especially in moderate cases wherein there is a mild hypoxemia. Those are the cases where self-proning and a patient is actually actively engaging in his own therapeutic process. So try to encourage patients doing it, and of course have due diligence. People who have spinal issues and so on. I mean, those needs to be excluded from this. And as far as the patient in the ICU, there are escalating respiratory supports that are available: HFNC, NIV, and mechanical intubation. And so those are the things that wherein the dynamicism is involved. So the patient has to be continuously monitored, and so those are the things that are required at this point.
You don't do 6-minute walk test every day for patients?
At the time of no. So at the time of discharge, we'll do that. Or if the patient is a borderline, 95-94%, then we'll ask the patient to walk for around 3 minutes. Don't need to, subject him for 6 minutes. Just about walking for some time and then look at saturation, see if there is any desaturation while doing exercise. So those are the patients who will probably end up being hypoxemic subsequently if it happens early in the course. And once the patient goes and comes back, we always do a 6-minute walk test properly along with the pulmonary function test. It's safest to do a diffusion lung capacity once the patient is at least 28 days from the time of first symptom. So we can do it as a first thing and then evaluate, so that will be a useful 6-minute walk will be a useful marker to see how the patient progresses also, and it's very, very inexpensive and patient can do it in any setup can be done.
Suresh, you are talking about call score and all that. Do you know what is Dublin-Boston score, which also, find out the severity, who will go for moderate, who will go for severity. Have you heard about that score? Dublin-Boston.
Lot of scoring system that I mentioned there, but most of the scoring system is most important there. Whatever score it has shown some validations, particularly the 4C score from that large BMJ group. They have did it there. Actually, the history group have did it. They validated the scores also. That's most important. We can come up with the own score, but we need to validate it in a large study populations so that it can be used for any people there. That's most important thing there. A lot of scoring system, not only that score, a lot of scoring system I came across, but whatever scoring system I've shown today, it is validated in the studies there. For example, the Spanish score, what I told, it is well validated in the Spanish cohort. Another one is 14,000 people they validated there, the 4C score there. So a lot of scoring system, but I've chosen only scores that are validated in a good clinical trials there.
Yeah, I saw Dublin-Boston score to find out IL-6 and IL-10. IL-6 as a pro-inflammatory and IL-10 as anti-inflammatory. The ratio and the score that cites the severity. You can say this man goes for more severe cases, more moderate. That's what I saw day before yesterday. No problem. Now, what about morphia? Injection morphia in eye dyspneic patient. Do you give injection morphine when the patient is highly dyspneic?
Yeah, like a palliative therapy, people are using it there. Otherwise, not as a treatment, I'm not doing it there.
Okay. Now, your final message, I think, before your voice goes down, please, you are in a good voice. Please give us this message, final drive home message. Okay.
So the first thing is there is no black and white answer for COVID so far is concerned, because there is no good data to show this is correct, this is wrong. There is no good data, and we need to learn from our mistakes. A lot of mistakes we committed because of lack of knowledge or lack of science's progress there. So we need to turn back this time, and we need to choose the right patients, right time, the right drug is little controversial, but right patients and time is almost suddenly clarified now, and right dose that's getting emerging now. So we need to choose a right patients, right time, right drug and right dose. Definitely it has an answer, but we need to think broad, learn from our mistakes. It's not black and white still.
Final question. Do you still use remdesivir apart from, though the solidarity trial says no use, according to the ACT trial, do you use remdesivir in your regular practice, and what is your advice for other doctors to use remdesivir?
I'm saying that
Final comment on remdesivir.
I'm using the remdesivir little early. Even before hypoxia, the person comes to me before 5th day, I start using remdesivir nowadays. With remdesivir alone, no steroids, and the person is not hypoxic. I want to get the benefit of remdesivir. If yes, within 5 days, yes.
Okay, very good. I think there are 47 questions more to be answered. I think I'll collect all the questions and I'll try to talk to Subra and then Suresh and Patavi and try to get the answer. Thank you very much for your nice participation. Really, COVID controversy is still continuing, but to a certain extent,